Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video you are about to see is a verse-by-verse exposition of the Olivet Discourse from an orthodox preterist viewpoint. I hope you enjoy it. In the previous two videos in this series in the playlist on the Olivet Discourse, on Orthodox Preterism, I gave an introduction to the discourse, and then I spent a lot of time talking about the setting, which showed that in the chapters and verses before Matthew 24, the theme was judgment on Israel over and over and over again. And in the third part of the PowerPoints that I'm presenting here, I pointed out that the telltale time indicator was found in Matthew 24, verse 34, which said that this generation would not pass away until all these things took place. Well, now I'm going to go through Matthew 24 verse by verse and show you how each verse could very easily be seen to have taken place before AD 70, even the verses which traditionally have been interpreted in a futuristic sense. All right, Matthew 24, starting with verse 4. See that no one leads you astray. Verse 5, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. Verse 6, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Verse 7, for nation will rise against nation, and there will be famines and earthquakes. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. All right, let's take verse 5 first. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. Did that take place in the 40 years running up to AD 70? Well, yes, it did. There were false messiahs everywhere in the first century. Now, I've listed on the PowerPoints here a lot of them. For the sake of those listening, I'll mention them very quickly. Theudas, not the one that was in Acts 5:36, but we find from Josephus, Theudas and the rest of these false messiahs. There was the Egyptian who's mentioned in Acts 21. There's Simon Magus, the famous Simon Magus. Of Acts 8, we have Dositheus the Samaritan, Menander, Theudas of Acts 5:36, Judas the Galilean in Acts 5:37, Simon from Githon in Samaria, false messiahs under the procuratorship of Felix, Menachem, son of Judas the Galilean, and Simon, son of Joras. There's false messiahs plenty saying that they were the Christ. Going on to verse 6, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Were there wars and rumors of wars? Absolutely. In Rome, in the year and a half before AD 70, when Jerusalem fell to the Romans, we had the famous year of the four emperors. From December 68 to December 69, you had Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. The Roman Empire was racked with civil war. Many people thought the empire was going to die. So there was wars and rumors of wars, just like Jesus predicted right before AD 70, right before the temple was destroyed. And then, of course, you've got the Jewish war itself, which was between 66 and 70 AD. And this was a remarkable war because it was right in the middle of the so-called Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And then all of a sudden, huge war with Israel. Now, let me quote from Josephus here. He said about this Jewish war, it was common to see cities filled with dead bodies, still lying unburied, and those of old men mixed with infants, all dead and scattered about together. Women also lay amongst them without any covering for their nakedness. Wars and rumors of wars happened right before AD 70. So now let's go to verse 7, and there will be famines and earthquakes. Did that happen in that period? Well, let's quote Josephus concerning famines. Josephus says this, then did the famine widen its progress and devoured the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of women and children that were dying by famine, and the lanes of the city were full of the dead bodies of the aged. The children also and the young men wandered about the marketplaces like shadows, all swelled with the famine, and fell down dead, whosoever their misery seized them. Sounds like it should be wheresoever their misery seized them. And how about earthquakes? Between 66 and 70 AD, here are the places that had earthquakes. This is during that 3.5-year period of the Jewish war. Crete, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Rome, Campania, Judea, Pompeii, Cyprus, Paphos, towns in Syria and Macedonia. Now, we know this from Tacitus, Grotius, Josephus, and Seneca. Well documented, earthquakes everywhere. What Jesus said was fulfilled in the 1st century A.D. Now let's move on to verses 9 through 13. The theme of these verses is enduring to the end. Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Verse 11, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. Verse 12, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Verse 13, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, how many times have you read that verse and thought, well, that refers to the end of the world? No, that's not what it refers to. Let's see what it does refer to. Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation. Now, was there tribulation between the apostate Jews and the Christian church in that period before the Jews were wiped out in AD 70? Yes, there was. All you have to do is read the New Testament scripture to see that tribulation. Here's Acts 8:1. On that day, a severe persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the land of Judea and Samaria. A severe persecution, Luke says. Luke also says in Acts 12, verses 1 through 2, about that time King Herod cruelly attacked some who belonged to the church and killed James, John's brother. That's James, the son of Zebedee. Killed him with the sword. Once again, the Jews are persecuting the church, delivering them up to tribulation, as Jesus predicted. 2 Corinthians 11, 24 through 25, Paul is talking. He says this, 5 times I received 39 lashes from the Jews. 3 times I was beaten with rods by the Romans. Once I was stoned by my enemies. Well, 5 times he received 39 lashes from the Jews. That's how the Jews punish people who were caught in their legal processes. So the Jews caught Paul 5 times and whipped him 39 lashes during those 5 times. He was delivered up to tribulation, just like Jesus predicted. And then Revelation 1:9 says, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation. So Jesus was correct. At that time, in this period running up to 87, in that 40-year period, Christians were delivered up to tribulation. Now let's go to verse 10. And then many will betray one another. Did that happen? All we have to do is look at the scripture, 2 Timothy 1:15. Paul is writing Timothy. He says this you know, all those in Asia have turned away from me, including Phygelus and Hermogenes. 2 Timothy 4:10. For Demas has deserted me because he loved this present world. 2 Timothy 4:16. At my first defense, no one stood by me, but everyone deserted me. The little quote I have here, it says, the saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. So, Paul was betrayed. He was betrayed by Phygelus and Hermogenes. He was betrayed by Demas. And then he says everyone betrayed him, deserted him at his first defense in Rome. Moving along to verse 11. And many false prophets will lead many astray. Did that happen? Well, yes, it did. We can read in the pages of Scripture, 2 Corinthians 11:13. For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. 2 Timothy 2:17, and their word was spread like gangrene. Hymenaeus and Philetus are among them. 2 Peter 2:1, but there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will secretly bring in destructive heresies. So here we have the apostles, Paul and Peter, talking about false apostles, false prophets, and false teachers. That fits pretty well with what Jesus said in verse 11 in the Olivet Discourse, and many false prophets will lead many astray. And then Luke says in Acts 13:6, when they had gone through the whole island as far as Paphos, that's the island of Crete, they came across a sorcerer, a Jewish false prophet named Bar-Jesus. So false prophets arose. They were operating openly in this period before the destruction of Jerusalem. We have some more here, false prophets, Acts 20:29 through 30. I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, and men will rise up with deviant doctrines. 1 Timothy 4:1. In later times, some will depart from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and the teaching of demons. Now, how many times have we read that? I think other versions, I think the King James says in the last days. And of course, everybody says, oh, yes, at the end of the world, the church will grow cold. People will depart from the faith. There will be a great apostasy. Timothy wasn't talking about the end of the world. He was talking about the end of the rabbinic order, when there was a great apostasy, when the church got pretty cold there and pretty persecuted right before AD 70. 2 John 1:7, many deceivers have gone out into the world. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Now notice this Antichrist is in the past. Have gone out. See, I've got the words emphasized in red there. Many deceivers have gone out. From the point of view of John, when he was writing that letter, many deceivers had gone out into the past. He says this is the deceiver and the Antichrist. He refers to those deceivers as the Antichrist. Now, I've said in an earlier tape that you cannot find the Antichrist in the scriptures. Well, you can find the phrase the Antichrist, but it's obviously here referring to someone in the past tense, not some the Antichrist at the end of time. 1 John 4:1 says, many false prophets have gone out into the world. All right, verse 12 in Olivet Discourse, lawlessness will be increased. Now, and again, this is quoting Josephus. And let me just say here, if you want to learn about prophecy, eschatology, you have to read Josephus. When you read Josephus, you will realize what happened there in this very crucial period of time during the Jewish war. It's fascinating reading, even if you just read it from a secular point of view, is history. But when you read it and you realize that this is what happened in fulfillment of what Jesus predicted to his disciples, it becomes even more exciting to read. So what does Josephus say about lawlessness increasing? He says this, in the first place, all the people of every place betook themselves to rapine, after which they got together in bodies, in order to rob the people of the country, insomuch that for barbarity and iniquity, those of the same nation did in no way differ from the Romans. In other words, the Jews weren't any different from the Romans. Nay, it seemed to be a much lighter thing to be ruined by the Romans than by themselves. This is one of many, many great quotes from Josephus. Go to verse 13. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. It's the end of the Jewish pre-Messianic age in AD 70 is the end that Jesus is talking about. You endure to the end of the Jewish persecution. And then once the Jewish persecution ends, because the nation of Israel is destroyed, then you're going to be saved. You're going to be delivered. It's not talking about the end of the world. All right, here's some scriptures here to emphasize this end of the age idea, being the end of the Jewish age. 1 Corinthians 10:11. Now these things happened to them as examples, happened to the Israelites, and they were written as a warning to us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Now, Paul is talking about his fellow Christians and him at that time in the first century. He says, we have had the ends of the ages come upon us. So obviously the ends of the ages cannot refer to the end of the world. It refers to the end of the Jewish age, because it ended when the church got started. Hebrews 9:26. But now he has appeared one time at the end of the ages for the removal of sin by the sacrifice of himself. The author of Hebrews is clearly referring to Jesus and Jesus' appearance, and he's talking about his first appearance at the end of the ages, at the end of the Jewish age, not the end of the world. And as a matter of fact, in fulfillment of this verse, every Jewish Christian that was in Jerusalem during that persecution survived and escaped, and we'll talk about later how that happened. All right, now let's go to Matthew 24:14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, I was raised as a young Christian. I was taught that, see there, the missionaries and the gospel and preachers of the gospel go out through the whole world, and then Jesus will come back. That's not what Jesus was talking about. The gospel of the kingdom was proclaimed throughout the whole world. That's talking about the Roman world as a testimony to all the nations. And then the end of the Jewish nation will occur. The end of the Jewish pre-Messianic age would happen in AD 70, not the end of the physical world. Now, let's talk about this ideal world. Let me back up here a minute and look at the verse again it says, the testimony of the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world. The whole world. And that sounds like the whole globe. But we have to realize that the gospel writers use that word world in the sense of the Roman Empire, not the physical globe, the Roman Empire. Here's an example of this. Luke 2:1 says this, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole empire should be registered. Now there, the Holman Christian Study Bible actually translates the word there, oikomene, which is normally translated world. They realized that it was not talking about the whole physical world because it was talking about a taxation from the Roman Empire that went out through all the empire. It's very clear from the context that that word there, oikomene, does not mean the physical world. It means the empire. So he states it. That's the same word that's used in Matthew 24:14. Colossians 1:6 says, the gospel is bearing fruit and growing all over the world. Now there, the world is cosmo, different word. But nonetheless, it's very clear there that the gospel had not grown into China. It had not come to the Americas. It was growing all over the Roman world, which is where the gospel got started. So that word world there should not be interpreted as the end of the whole world. The gospel should go out through the whole Roman Empire, and then the end would come. And that actually happened. The gospel had spread all throughout the Roman Empire by AD 70 when Jerusalem went down. All right, let's continue now with verse 15. Verse 15 mentions this. I won't quote the whole verse. The abomination that causes desolation standing in the holy place. Now, this verse has caused a lot of confusion, all right? And I'll tell you right up front that some preterists disagree on this. I'm going to give you what I think is the most reasonable preterist interpretation of it. To find out what it means, what that phrase means, we need to go to Luke 21, verse 20. And that verse says this, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that its desolation has come near. So desolation just means abandonment, destruction, and so forth. And abomination is typically used to refer to defilement by idols. So what happened here, the Roman army came and desolated the land and destroyed it. And they did that by causing idolatrous abominations to be spread. And that was because of their idolatrous incense, the standards they held with the Roman eagles and so forth, which they worshipped. So the abomination that caused desolation was the Roman army getting ready to destroy Jerusalem. Now this Roman army, this abomination that caused the desolation of Israel, it was standing in the holy place. The Greek there is in topo hagio. N is in, and topo is place, and hagio, is holy, in the place holy, or in the holy place. Now this is likely, and I'm almost sure it's not the holy place in the temple that has the same name. 7 out of 9 times in the New Testament, that room in the temple, the rectangular room that had this candlestick and the showbread, it was just called hagios with no topos next to it. In other words, it was called the holy, and then you just have to supply the idea of place, the term place. But here in the Olivet Discourse, the word topos is explicitly there. It's not implied at all. It's there in topo hagio. Okay, so the holy place is the holy land of Israel. Is what that's referring to. So when you see the Roman armies standing in the holy land of Israel, then you will know that that Roman army is an abomination, an idolatrous abomination that has caused the desolation of Israel. Verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now here's what happened. This is gotten from Josephus. The Roman general Cestius Gallus surrounded Jerusalem in 66 AD. That was at the very beginning of the Jewish war. Inside Jerusalem, there were Jewish Christians, along with the pagan, not the pagan, but the non-believing Christians in Jerusalem. They were there, And when they saw Cestius Gallus surround Jerusalem, they would immediately remember what Jesus said. When you see the abomination that causes desolation surrounding Jerusalem, well, they saw it. They saw Cestius Gallus, and they saw that they were surrounded. And so they say, well, now Jesus told us we're supposed to flee to the mountains when that happens. But here's the problem. How could they flee? The city was surrounded by Cestius Gallus's troops. But then something very interesting happened. Cestius inexplicably withdrew from the city. Historians still don't know why he did it. There's speculation, but nobody knows for sure. And when that happened, the zealots who were in Jerusalem, the fanatical Roman-hating zealots said, God has judged Cestius Gallus. We're going to beat him. So they chased Cestius Gallus a little bit north of the city, north and west of the city at Beth Horon, and they beat him there and won a military battle. Well, now the zealots are sure that God's going to miraculously deliver them, and so their pride got puffed up, and they went back in the city and maintained their stubborn resistance to the Jews, to the Romans, for the next 3.5 years. But the Christians weren't that stupid, because they had Jesus' advance warning. When you see the abomination that causes desolation surrounding the city, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And they did. Where did they go? They went to a place called Pella, which is just north and east of Jerusalem. This is reported by Eusebius and Josephus. They went there, and they were perfectly safe. They were safe for the rest of the war. Verse 17, let the one who is on the housetops not go down to take what is in his house. Now, housetops were flat in the first century. People could run all the way out of the city just by hopping from rooftop to rooftop. And so Jesus says, look, you don't need to go down into the house. You need to get out of there. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you need to get out of town, and you need to get out fast. And this is a side note. Note how improbable it is that houses in the future are going to have flat roofs. Now, I know that's possible, but it sounds very first century to me, especially when you see that it's perfectly easy to run over the tops of roofs to get out of Jerusalem in a hurry, which is what Jesus wanted them to do. All right, now we go to verse 18. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. Now, at that time, when men would harvest crops, they would strip down to their shirts, leaving their cloak in the corner of the field. So it would be logical, if you're getting ready to run back and get your cloak. And Jesus said, don't even take time to do that. You need to get out. You need to get out before those zealots get back and trap you in the city. You don't have time. Get out. This is first century language. This is not the language of the future. Verse 19 says this, and alas for women who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days. Now, Jesus is just expressing concern here. He's saying, look, if you're going to have to run in a hurry, it's tough when you're pregnant, and it's tough when you're nursing. Now, notice the parallel passage in Luke 21:23. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. Now, that phrase, land, is extremely important in preterist eschatology. The Greek word is gay. In the Old Testament, the word is eretz, but it's gay in the New Testament. It can either be translated land or earth. Now, the Holman Christian Study Bible translates it as land from the context. Land is an automatic, idiomatic expression for the land of Israel. So, this great tribulation, the so-called Great Tribulation, it is not worldwide. It is in Israel. There will be great distress in the land. All right, continuing on, verse 20. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been seen from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. That's verse 21. Verse 22, and if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, Why did Jesus say, pray that your flight may not be in the winter on a Sabbath? Very simply, in the winter it's hard to travel, hard to flee. Sabbath was also hard because the rabbis only allowed you to travel 1/2 mile on the Sabbath, and the Christians had to get to Pella would have to travel more than 1/2 mile. And Christian Jews still might be scrupulous and still under the law, and they might stop after 1/2 mile and not escape. Verse 21, the famous Great Tribulation. Now, did the Great Tribulation happen? Did the Great Tribulation happen in this period before AD 70? Well, here's some examples from Josephus. I'm going to read them real quick, and you tell me if this is a Great Tribulation or not a Great Tribulation. The daytime was spent in the shedding of blood, and the night in fear. It is common to see cities filled with dead bodies. Escapees, this is escapees from Jerusalem, were caught by Romans and crucified before the walls. There were 500 crucified every day. The escapees were disemboweled by the Romans, who were looking for the gold that was swallowed by the Jews trying to save their valuables. Their burial consisted of throwing dead bodies into ravines. Fathers were slaughtering whole families to keep the Romans from doing it. Mothers were killing, roasting, and eating their own children. Parents were ripping food out of their kids' mouths and swallowing the food before the kid could get it. Thieves were sticking swords up the rear ends of people who wouldn't tell them where food was. The land all over was filled with fire and blood, Josephus says. The Sea of Galilee was red from blood. Dead bodies everywhere were causing a horrible stench, littering the shores, bloating in the sun, rotting and splitting apart. My friends, that is the Great Tribulation. Now, there's a phrase here in verse 21 that is a problem not only for futurists, but also for preterists also. This Great Tribulation has not been seen from the beginning of the world, never will be. The problem is that Noah's flood was a tribulation that was greater than what happened to the Romans in AD 70. After all, in AD 70, you had one city went down. Noah's flood, the whole world went down. And as far as the futurists are concerned, the Great Tribulation at the end of the world, what, 1/3 of the rivers will burn up, 1/4 of the world, the green grass is destroyed, the waters become as wormwood. Yeah, it's bad stuff happening, but it's not as bad as the whole world being flooded. So what did Jesus mean when he said this? All right, now, the answer to this is actually fairly simple. This is an example of Hebrew hyperbole, exaggeration. And to give you an example of this, let's look at Ezekiel 5:9. Ezekiel says this, because of all your detestable practices, I will do to you what I have never done before and what I will never do again. Now, what was Ezekiel referring to? He was referring to the destruction of Israel not in AD 70, but in 586 BC. And he says, I will do to you what I have never done before and what I will never do again. That means the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 would never happen again. But it did happen again. This is exaggeration. It's just extreme exaggeration, hyperbole. That's what this is. And this is what Jesus is saying is, boy, this Great Tribulation during the Jewish War is going to be really, really bad. He did not mean for us to literally compare it with the destruction of the world during Noah's flood. Verse 22, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, who are the elect? Well, let me just say that for pre-trib futurists who say that the church is jerked out of the world before the Great Tribulation, what is the elect still doing there in the Great Tribulation if they've been raptured out before the 7-year period? That doesn't make any sense. And besides, if they are raptured out, why would they care about the days being cut short? They're safe in heaven, according to the pre-trib theory. Well, I don't believe the pre-trib theory. I believe this is talking about the Christian Jews who are caught up in the midst of this Jewish war. Now, preterists have a little problem here, perhaps. The elect has escaped in 66 A.D. when Cestius Gallus surrounded the city. The Roman general surrounded the city, and then he retired inexplicably, and the Jewish Christians fled the city and they went to Pella. So they're safe, right? So why do they care whether the days of the Jewish war are cut short or not? Why couldn't the war just go on and on and on, and they stay in Pella? Well, the answer to that is, if the Romans had kept killing Jews past AD 70 after they destroyed the city, Christian Jews in Pella would have eventually gotten killed by the Romans. They would have perished eventually. So the war ended, however. The city fell, the Romans quit attacking, and that was the end of it. If the city hadn't fallen, you can bet the Romans would have gone around to the cities outside of Jerusalem and taken their vengeance on the Jews, as they did in many cases already. And they would have gotten Pella eventually. So this verse still makes perfect sense on the preterist scheme. For the sake of the elect in Pella, the days of the Great Tribulation, the days of the Jewish war, were cut short. All right, so now let's look at Matthew 24, verse 23. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. Verse 24. For false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Verse 25, see, I have told you beforehand. Verse 26, so, if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Now, how does this fit AD 70? Well, first, in these four verses, we see mentioned false Christs and false prophets that Jesus warned them against. Now, I've already mentioned all the false messiahs that were everywhere in the first century. I won't read them to you again. I have them listed over here on the left side of the PowerPoint. Let me give you a quotation from Josephus. Josephus says, quote, impostors and demagogues under the guise of divine inspiration provoked revolutionary actions and impelled the masses to act like madmen. They led them out into the wilderness so that their God would show them signs of imminent liberation. So yeah, they were false messiah, false Christ, false prophets, false messiahs everywhere. In verse 27, it says, the coming of the Son of Man is as lightning. All right. What is the point of lightning? Lightning is visible, it is sudden, and it causes damage when it hits the earth. So it's a perfect symbol for something visible, something sudden, and something bringing judgment. And the judgment is visible and obvious, and it's sudden. Now, the point of lightning being visible is that Jesus is trying to say, look, all these false messiahs, they were hidden. They were in the desert claiming to be the Messiah, but they weren't public. Don't follow some secret Messiah. A secret Messiah is a false Messiah. But when you see the coming of the Son of Man and judgment on Jerusalem, it's going to be obvious. It's going to be visible. It's going to be clear. You're going to see the city go up in smoke. And remember, coming here is not coming at the end of the world, coming in judgment on Jerusalem, not at the second advent, which I do believe. I am not a heretical preterist. I believe that Jesus is coming back physically, but that's not what he was talking about here. Okay? Now, how about the suddenness of the coming of the Son of Man? Right, as I mentioned earlier, right in the middle of the Pax Romana, the Jewish war just started suddenly. Bang! It was ridiculous how that war started. If you read Josephus, you'll see what happened, which I won't go into detail here, but it never should have happened. There was no reason for it, but it did happen suddenly. So that verse 27 fits perfectly with the preterist interpretation. Verse 28, Jesus says, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, the point of this proverb, again, is visibility. You got a dead Jerusalem, you're going to see the vultures gathering around it. In other words, you see a Jerusalem under siege, you're going to see the Romans circling like vultures ready to destroy the place. And it's going to be obvious and it's going to be visible. It's not going to be like those hidden false messiahs in the desert. A vulture will make a corpse evident. A corpse might be hard to see on the ground, but all of a sudden you look up in the air, you see vultures circling around, then you say, somebody's died. So that's the point. Vultures are making the corpse of the Jewish kingdom obvious, not secret, like these secret messiahs. Now, there's an interesting point here. That word for vulture, the Greek word, can easily be translated. It's the same word for eagle. And it could be that the eagles of the Roman Empire, the eagles that were on their standards, were circling the city, gathering around. And I suspect that Jesus was referring to that. I can't prove it, of course, but I think that's what he was talking about. But at any rate, the point is that the destruction of Jerusalem will be sudden and visible and will not be secret. Verse 29, Jesus says the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. Now, here's a problem. And this verse used to throw me. I would say, well, now, that never happened. So it must be at the end of the world, right? Well, here's an interesting thing. There's lots of places in the Old Testament where this kind of rhetoric is used. It's used when prophets talk. It's prophetic type talk. It's apocalyptic type talk. I think Gary DeMar calls it decreationist rhetoric. Somebody calls it decreationist rhetoric. I like that word. It means, and that kind of rhetoric means is that a political entity is about to be destroyed and new folks are coming into town to rule the kingdom. Now, my favorite one of these verses is Isaiah 13:10. This is Isaiah talking about Babylon. He says this, "Indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shine." Well, now, obviously, Isaiah didn't think the sun was going to rise up from the horizon and be dark. That's impossible. And the moon will not shine. This is just prophetic speak. This is prophet speak. This is just trying to say, hey, the whole natural order is shaking, and that's a symbolic of the fact that the political order is shaking, which is, of course, what happened when the Persians beat Babylon. Babylon's going down, Isaiah is trying to say. And when the Persians took over in 539, there was no records of solar or lunar eclipses in that pivotal year when the Persians beat the Babylonians. No solar eclipses. It had nothing to do with that. It's just prophetic, symbolic language. Likewise, in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus didn't mean that the sun was going to be dark and the moon was going to be dark when the Roman Empire went down. Now, if you find this hard to believe, I've got some more examples of this kind of rhetoric. Prophetic decreation rhetoric referring to political judgment, I'll call it. Let's look at Isaiah 24, 21 through 23. I'm going to read these quickly. On that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven, that's the stars above, and kings of the earth below. The moon will be put to shame and the sun disgraced. Isaiah 34, verses 3 through 4. There, referring to the nations, their slain will be thrown out, and the stench of their corpses will rise. There's the political overthrow. The mountains will flow with their blood. All the heavenly bodies will dissolve. The skies will roll up like a scroll, and the stars will all wither as leaves wither on the vine and foliage on the fig tree. Some of this language you might recognize from Revelation too. Ezekiel 32, 7 through 8. When I snuff you out, speaking to Pharaoh, I will cover the heavens and darkness and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. I will darken all the shining lights in the heavens over you. I'll darken the stars. So he's going to darken the sun, darken the moon, darken the stars. Joel 2:10, the earth quakes before them, the sky shakes, the sun and moon grow dark, and the stars cease their shining. Well, this obviously is not referring to astronomical events that happened at a point in time. This is prophetic rhetoric. I've got some more of this just to drive the point home. Joel 2:31, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and inspiring day of the Lord comes. Now, Peter quoted this in Acts 2:20. I'll ask you a simple question. When did the sun go dark and the moon turn to blood at Pentecost? The simple answer to that question is it never did. Peter didn't mean for it to. He was just using prophetic language. Peter's day of the Lord was the coming judgment on Jerusalem at AD 70. He said that's what's going to come. Joel 3:15, the sun and moon will grow dark and the stars will cease their shining. Amos 8:9, and in that day, this is the declaration of the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon. I will darken the land in the daytime. Jeremiah 4:23 through 24. I looked at the earth and it was formless and empty, to the heavens and their light was gone. I looked at the mountains and they were quaking. All the hills shook. Now, I went through a lot of verses there to drive the point home. This is typically the way prophets speak. Jesus was not talking about something that's going to happen at the end of the world. Now, verse 30 says this, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven will appear. Now, that's a translation I think that I've literally done here. Sign of the Son of Man in heaven will appear. Usually it's translated like, and then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in the sky. Then will appear in the sky the sign of the Son of Man. That's how it's usually translated, which sounds extremely futurist. Here's the generic example here on my PowerPoints. Then will appear in the sky the sign of the Son of Man. Now, if you're looking for a sign of the Son of Man in the sky, that makes it sound like you're going to see something up there in the sky that tells you that Jesus is coming back, which of course did not happen in AD 70 or before then, so therefore it must happen in the future, so say the futurists. But I love, this is one of my favorite verses. It means you have to go to the Greek here, but this is the way it should be translated. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven will appear. And before I go to the Greek, let me just give you a preview here. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven. What's in heaven? Well, first of all, it's heaven, not sky. The word for sky in Greek can be heaven or sky 50-50, just like us. Sometimes we talk about up in the heavens or up in the skies. In Chinese, it's the same way. They have one Chinese word for both. In Greek's the same way. So let's translate it in heaven, okay? Now we got the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. What's in heaven? The sign? Is the sign in the sky, or is it the Son of Man in heaven? It's the Son of Man in heaven, Jesus in heaven, and then his sign will appear. What's the sign? The sign is the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of and the final judgment on all these evil and wicked generation that killed all the prophets from Abel to Zechariah and who murdered the Messiah. That was the sign that was going to appear. It's the sign of the Son of Man who's in heaven. Now, you say, well, why should we translate it that way? Well, let's, and by the way, this interpretation I just gave you is the one is advocated by Adam Clarke, the famous commentator, who is he's preterist in a lot of his places. He's not a complete preterist, but in this particular place here, he says this is the way it should be translated. So I'm not making this up. Now let's look at the Greek. I got the Greek right here. It says kai tote phanesatai to semeon to huio to anthropu en to urano. Now, if you don't know Greek, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to put the English words under each, like it's an interlinear here, the English words under each Greek word. Kai is and, tote is then, phanesatai is shall appear, to semeon to huio is the sign of the Son of Man. To anthropo is, let me say that again. To semeon to huio to anthropo is the sign of the Son of Man, and in to urano is in heaven. Excuse my Greek pronunciation, I'm sure it's terrible. All right, so if you take the Greek and just lay it out in English straightforward, where is urano closest to? It's closest to the Son of Man, because the sign is way over here in the beginning of the sentence. Semeon is in the beginning of the sentence, but the Son of Man is at the end of the sentence, and urano is right after the Son of Man. So urano in heaven modifies the Son of Man. So it's the Son of Man in heaven. His sign will appear, the sign of the Son of Man who is in heaven. So that verse does not impel us to believe that there's going to be a sign in the sky when Jesus is about to come back at the end of the world. Now, let's go to verse 30. All the tribes of the land will mourn. Now, most translations of this verse give a futurist bias because they say all the tribes of the earth will mourn. The English Standard Version, the ESV, does that. All the tribes of the earth. Well, that does sound like the whole world is involved in the Great Tribulation and the 200 million man army is coming from China and all hell's breaking loose. That's what it sounds like. But as I mentioned earlier, that word gay, this is the genitive form here, gays, is earth or land. It can go either way. It all depends on translator's choice, translator's bias, however you want to do it. It could easily be translated by land. Now let me go to Adam Clarke, the famous commentator I told you about, 19th century commentator. He says this, by taste gaze of the land in the text is evidently meant here. as in several other places, the land of Judea and its tribes. Notice all the tribes of the land. Israel had 12 tribes, if you recall. The land of Judea and its tribes, I'm continuing with Clark, either its then inhabitants or the Jewish people wherever found. Okay? Now, so Clark says translated as land, and he says take the word tribes, that fits better with land than it does with earth, because the Jews had 12 tribes. Now let me give you a quote from R.T. France, who any evangelical Bible student will recognize. He's a famous evangelical theologian. He says this: with one exception, the Greek term translated earth, that's gay, is used elsewhere in the New Testament as referring to the land of Palestine, which also is observed repeatedly in the Septuagint. So, that's, to me, is a slam dunk. Translated as land instead of earth, and you got a preterist interpretation of the Olivet Discourse. Most translations have tribes here, which, of course, favors a preterist view because it sounds like the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes. The NIV has nations. The Holman Christian Study Bible has peoples, which favors futurist. Makes it sound all the nations of the earth, all the peoples of the earth. Yeah, it sounds like a worldwide disaster, worldwide great tribulation. But as Adam Clark says, tribes is a perfectly legitimate translation. All right, moving on with the next verse. Still on the same verse. It says, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." See the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, this verse really sounds like it's referring to Jesus coming back at the end of the world. And so this is one of my favorite verses to explain. We need to also consider Matthew 24:64, which is 34 verses later in the same chapter. Jesus is talking to Caiaphas, the high priest, and he says, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven," which is the same phrase, just repeated later on. Now, here's the first problem for preterists. How can Caiaphas, in Matthew 24:64, how can he see Jesus coming on the clouds in AD 70? Caiaphas is too old for that. He was probably old enough to take over the high priesthood, and he would not probably be living in AD 70. All right, well, here's the solution to that. Let's go to Matthew 26:64. Jesus said to him, Caiaphas, "You," and this "you" number one here is singular, "you," singular, "have said it yourself, Caiaphas. Nevertheless, I tell you," plural. Jesus now turns to the Sanhedrin and all the people who are accusing him. "You," plural. "Nevertheless, I tell you," plural. Hereafter, "you," plural, y'all, if you use the southern version of the second person plural, "you," plural, "will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." What Jesus is saying is, well, he's not saying that Caiaphas is going to live to 80, 70, but there's going to be plenty of people in the Sanhedrin or the Sanhedrin, who are around Caiaphas. Some of those are going to live, and they're going to see the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That would be the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. This is language taken out of Daniel, referring to judgment. We'll talk about this verse later. And I've got the Greek here for those Greek freaks who would like to check me out on that "you" being singular at first, and then you switch into plural as he moves from addressing Caiaphas to the Sanhedrin. So that explains that verse from a preterist point of view. Now there's another problem for preterists. How can the Sanhedrin see Jesus coming in AD 70? Because Jesus didn't come physically in AD 70. Jesus was in heaven in AD 70. Well, the solution is to take "see" in the sense of understanding. Like, I don't see how to do this math problem. I don't understand it. The Sanhedrin would understand in AD 70 that Jesus had judged them when they saw their city being burnt up, going up in flames. They would understand then. They would see. The "see" was never meant to be taken literally. Still on verse 30. The futurists have a problem here too. The first problem for the futurists, and I'll drop down to to the phrase here in verse 64, you, Caiaphas, you, the Sanhedrin, will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, if Jesus is speaking to the Sanhedrin, or even to Caiaphas, I believe he was speaking to the Sanhedrin, how could the Sanhedrin see Jesus sitting at the right hand of power if that happens 2,000 years later? They're going to be dead long before 2,000 plus years later. And since futurists love to talk about the literal interpretation of the Olivet Discourse, if they say that Jesus is coming literally on the clouds of heaven, physically and bodily, literally coming on the clouds of heaven, then why shouldn't the seeing the Son of Man be literal also? So how can the Sanhedrin see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven? You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. How can the Sanhedrin? They don't live 2,000 plus years. They have a normal human lifespan. They're not going to be able to see Jesus coming back literally on the clouds of heaven at the end of time. So that's the futurist's first problem. The second problem is this. How can the Sanhedrin still be in existence at the end of the world in order to see Jesus? Must we posit a revived Sanhedrin? See, that's what futurists love to do. The scripture talks about Rome, and they say, well, it's talking about the revived Roman Empire in the future. The temple, it's a rebuilt temple in the future. Well, maybe we have to have a revived Sanhedrin. I don't know. That's the end of my verse-by-verse explanation of the Olivet Discourse. If you enjoy this and would be interested in more preterist eschatology, I'm going to take up the book of Revelation next. Please subscribe to my channel, and thank you very much.